Welcome to the session, Failing Your Preclinical is a Success, sponsored by Brentwood and Cosina, and presented by Tom Kramer, President and CEO of Kablooey Design, and Mitch Maiman, co-founder and president of Intelligent Product Solutions. If you have any questions for the speakers, please use the chat box on the right-hand side. Over to you, Tom and Mitch.
Well, hi everyone, and thanks for attending this session for MD&M. This session is Failing Your Preclinical is a Success, and we're glad that you're here. We're excited to be here talking about testing and preclinical work in product development. I am here with Mitch Maiman from IPS, and we will start by introducing ourselves and telling you a little bit about our companies and our background.
Hi, my name is Mitch Maiman. I'm the president and co-founder of Intelligent Product Solutions. We were been in business for about 13 plus years, located in New York. We're a team of engineers and some designers focused on product development, product realization. Primarily, we're the folks that take the concepts and make them into a reality. We take products from early stage all the way into production and manufacturing launch, and support our clients through all of the manufacturing and certification processes, including those related to FDA.
Thanks, Mitch. And my name is Tom Kramer. I'm president and CEO of Kablooey Design, which is a sister company to IPS. We're both under the umbrella of Forward Industries. We are the Forward Industries Development Group. And Kablooey, much like IPS, has been doing med device design and development for 30 years now. So I've got a background in medical device development that strategically focuses mostly on user-centered design, the mechanical and the industrial design, and the human factors part of the product development cycle. So with those two backgrounds, we were really excited to talk to you guys today about testing and preclinical testing in our development processes, how we go about it, and how failures can be a success. So we're kind of breaking this talk into three sections. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of preclinical testing, because people think of a lot of things when the word preclinical is thrown out there. And then I'm going to share a little bit about how design thinking and human factors also plays into that preclinical type of testing. And then Mitch is going to share a bit about some best practices and some techniques and methods used for testing throughout the course of the development process. And throughout all this, we'll share some best practices and maybe have a case study to talk about at some point as well. So let's jump into it. The first real question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it so important to do testing? And of course, we all understand the importance when it comes to safety and efficacy. But there's other reasons that it's important. And one of the reasons is the design process itself is not necessarily the smoothest thing in the world, especially when you're working in the medical device world. So it can feel a lot like this as a chart from beginning to end. The process can often feel like this, but it doesn't have to be. And good testing will help take some of that mess out of the process. So if we condense the process into a chart, this is what we've done to try to make sense of that, with the green areas being the activities that people like Mitch and myself engage in during the product development process. But often when it comes to testing, most people think that testing happens here in the process early for designers, like design research to figure out a technology, or they think it happens at the end in validation. But honestly, nothing could be further from the truth. And if you look into some of the guidance documents like HE75 or 62366, there's a lot of emphasis about how research and testing needs to be a continuum throughout your development process. And what we're trying to show here is that even though it's a continuum, it's also iterative within that continuum, because it weaves into your development and your engineering activities. So nobody stressed this better, I think, than Albert Einstein when he said, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes finding the solution. So what he's talking about here is understanding the problem, which is testing and research-focused testing to try to understand the problem. And over the years that Mitch and I have been doing this, we've really seen this proven out to be so true, that the focus on this just can't be underestimated. So there's several different kinds of preclinical testing. And again, when people think of preclinical, they think of going into animals and going into the full setup. And of course, for sure, live animal testing is one way, a common way to do preclinical testing. But there's also other methods like cadavers or even simulations, which are often called our bench studies, but they might be simulated. They might have a simulated subject. You might have simulated users or simulated devices, and you might have a simulated environment. And these kind of tests you can do for a number of various different reasons. And you can get really good feedback out of some of these tests if they're done right. So I wanted to share a number of ways that we've done them here that we found to be extremely beneficial in really honing down and defining our requirements. And as you know, you start your requirements early, but then you continue those requirements as a living document throughout the early development process. So obviously, to start with the most common one, there's live animal testing. So this is in vivo testing, and often it's done under these conditions. You have a preclinical environment, so you're simulating your actual environment pretty closely. And the samples I'm going to share here are very surgery oriented. Obviously, not every device or project that you're going to be on is necessarily surgical in nature. It could be home use, it could be therapeutic, but we're just honing on this one to share, and the example translates. We'd use working prototypes in these situations. We would bring in actual users and researchers. That would be us, would be observers, and we'd be using animal subjects, live animal subjects. So there's a lot you can learn, and if I'm doing this kind of talk in a class, I'm asking the class, I'm throwing these things out, and I'm asking the class, okay, when would you choose this type? What would you be looking for if you were going to choose this type? Being that we're not in a classroom situation, we'll just discuss through these things. But obviously, this works really well for your final testing. So when you're getting down to your final formative test, and you're going to do that summative test when you're moving into validation, this kind of activity is very strong.
I can add a couple of points related to this, and I think the live animal and the cadaver testing can provide another set of data that's really important. Certainly, the user interactions and the way things will operate functionally are really important. But a lot of times when we're doing medical technology products, and not just medical technology products, the parameters that are needed for define the requirements are not always well defined. And taking the mock-ups or the models that you use for doing these testings, sometimes you want to use these as data acquisition models. And there's cases where I've worked and my team has worked on some surgical devices involved with cutting and sewing, that sort of the mechanical properties of the organs that you want to be able to extract those material properties as an example, because that will then allow you to do benchtop testing without the need for having live animals or a cadaver. So again, these testings can also have a very strong, besides the human factors impact, very strong impact on the engineering side as a means of extracting information you can use to do testing that doesn't require the use of live animals or cadavers.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mitch. That's exactly how someone from the class would answer the question. When would you use this? So when you need to understand the performance of tissue, or how your device or system or solution is going to interact with tissue, and you need these parameters, and these parameters can only be defined in a live animal situation. That's when this is very helpful. And yeah, that goes a long ways into helping with your requirements. There's also in vitro situations where you go into an actual environment. So, you'll use this kind of thing when the environment is extremely important to the device or system that you're working on and how it's used. So you've got an actual environment, you've got working prototypes, and you bring real users in, and you might also use researchers as users, but you're using in vitro bench test subjects. So you choose this kind of test when you don't necessarily need parameters that are coming from human tissue, or at least ones that, if you do need that, they're easily simulated with some sort of bench model. And so you're gathering different types of parameters that are usually more focused on the performance of the device and those parameters, and not so much on the interaction with, say, human tissue or human fluids or the human electrophysiology. And then you've got simulated function. So this is sort of a bench test, also an in vitro situation, where you create a simulated environment and you bring in working prototypes. There's no real users in there. The researchers are the users, and your subjects are bench test fixtures that are set up. So these tend to be earlier studies, and we'll talk about formative and summative studies in a minute, but these tend to work really well when you're doing that formative testing and you're trying to learn things early on. And this feeds really well into your requirements document as well, especially your user requirements and your product requirements. You learn a lot from doing this kind of work, for that focus. And then a few other ones here. There's just kind of a straight simulated use where there's really no environment, but you do have some working prototypes. You've got no real users, and your researchers, again, are gathering data. So this is more of the design research type of research that you see early on in the process. And you've got bench test subjects, again, so dummies or simulations or fixtures that you're using to do your testing. So similar to the last one, but these are the researchers actually learning and gathering data about how prototypes would function in a given use case scenario. So this can often be about defining use case at a very preliminary or early level. And then lastly, simulated use that's really focused on human factors. So the human factors and usability, you try to create an actual environment often, but best case scenario, you actually get into an actual environment. You actually bring in working prototypes. You bring in real users. The researchers are also there to double as observers or users, but you're using, again, bench test fixtures or dummies. And this is often the scenario when you're doing your final formative test, often not your summative testing, but your formative testing when you're a little further down the road and you want to prove out all of your design decisions before you go into validation. And this can be a very helpful way to test. So those are some of the most common ways and another one is, again, this is another simulated environment where you bring in real users. So it's the same as the last one, but you bring in real users and your researchers are observers. So this is more of what we call an ethnography. So this defines an ethnography in a simulated environment as opposed to the ethnography in the actual environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about ethnography in a minute, just because that's one of the great ways to get early data and your design inputs developed in your requirements document. Obviously, there's different types of prototypes that we use in this testing, again, based on what you're trying to achieve with the test and what type of test you're in and how far you are in the process. You'll have a different type of prototype. So just, from a general sense, there's prototypes that are really basically nothing more than ergonomic models. So this is obviously very early testing. This is very much in that sort of design research level of testing. And really what we're doing is we're taking simple prototypes that don't take a lot of time, money, or effort to develop, but we're putting them in the hands of actual users and getting actual user feedback to help define our design inputs. And then those design inputs are what we're going to test to later on in further tests. So these ones here that I'm showing you are made out of just a urethane foam, but they could be made out of anything. There's a lot of ways to get really simple ergonomic models. Also, there's, from a human factors standpoint, there's user interface models as well. And these are models that are a little bit higher function. And what you're really doing is you're creating a functionality in every one of the user interface areas that exists. And again, this is used more often when you're developing your user requirements and some of your product requirements as they relate to use case. And then you put it in front of, again, real users, and you get that feedback to help develop your design inputs. And then, of course, as we get further down the road, there's semi-functional prototypes. So these are prototypes that you're a little further along in the process now, and they have a level of functionality. Like this one, for instance, it could do all of the, it could look like and act like it was doing everything, but it's obviously not delivering the actual therapy. But for all functional user interface purposes, it seems like it is. And that's also handy for human factors and usability feedback and for risk and things like that.
If I can jump in just for a moment, a lot of what Tom's describing also applies to software, the software parts of a solution. As I'm sure all of you experience, these days almost everything is a smart connected device, which means that you're no longer bringing the physical world, you're merging the physical world with the digital interface. And going back to the user interface models, I mean, we often use, and I know Tom does this as well, storyboards and wireframes to just show to gather feedback on how people will interact with the via software, interact with the system solution. And then to Tom's point here about semi-functional prototypes, we often work in the software side of the work we do. We often work in an agile development process, which means we tend to make small, simple models of the software that we can test these very low-level subsystems to sort of monitor and explore user interaction with the software applications themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Mitch. There's a lot of ways to prototype. From an electronic standpoint, breadboarding to software and doing visual wireframes to ergonomics where you're actually touching and feeling, and it's got a semi-level of functionality. But absolutely, these ideas span across all of those disciplines for sure, and are usually going on in parallel or close to in parallel.
Great.
And then, of course, we've got the fully functional prototypes, and sometimes these can be alpha units, sometimes they're called beta units, but the idea is that everything on them is functional and it works. So obviously you're further down the development process when you're using these kind of prototypes. However, depending on what you're trying to do, you can bring a high level of functionality early on, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So in the case of software, like Mitch was talking about, you can get software that appears to the user to be fully functional, at an early stage, get that kind of feedback. Here, you can 3D print things with physical models. You can paint them. You can get them working. You can load them up with their electronics, and the users can get real data. So this also plays, right down into those trials where, you're getting results and histology, and you're finding out how well the therapy actually worked. So it kind of spans that gambit. But the point here is that it can start a lot earlier than people think. Most people think of this kind of thing when they're thinking of let's test a prototype, but it can start very, very early in the process with very simple prototypes. And that's actually the preferred method. So all of this, I want to talk a little bit now and switch gears and talk a little bit about how does design thinking and human factors sort of play into this clinical testing? Because honestly, there's a lot of things happening at the same time. You've got your design and development going. You have your sort of risk management plan going. And then you probably have your human factors and usability going at the same time. And risk and human factors and development, they all tie into each other at different areas throughout the process. But when you look at your research and when you think about successful failure and failing a preclinical, you have to think about it from a design thinking standpoint. And if you tell yourself that you are doing design research, you start to implement this successful failure mentality. If you tell yourself you're trying to pass a test, you're going to think about it differently, and you're going to set your tests up differently. So you really want to set your tests up to learn as much as you can. Remember the Einstein quote, learning as much as you can about the problem. And that's really what design research is. So doing the research and the testing to understand what we should design. That's really what it's all about. So one of the best methods for doing this is I just want to focus on really quickly is ethnography. I mentioned that before. And Margaret Mead is a famous anthropologist from decades ago. And she made this statement, which is very true. And I think most of us that have worked in the med tech industry for any length of time have seen this, that what people say and what people do, and then what people say they do, are entirely different things. And this is why when you're looking for voice of customer data to drive user requirements, you can't just ask the user. You have to use a little bit more robust and in-depth methodology to get at what's actually going on. So I just want to share kind of how some of this early design research work is done, and then we'll shift, and Mitch is going to share a little bit more about how some of these tests are formally done throughout the process. So in ethnography, we're trying to gain empathy. So this means we're trying to understand and identify with the user's context and emotions and goals and motivations. So having that empathy mindset where we go into a test saying, I just want to understand what the user is going to go through, the patient or whoever the user is. This allows us to succeed no matter what the results are. And the idea is you want to be this fly on the wall. So ethnography is all about observation, being the fly on the wall and watching what's going on. So we like to think of these kinds of little research tests that we do as formative studies. So we're doing formatives to learn, so we can do a summative to do our design verification testing, right? So the summative is the final test at the end. So we set ourselves up with a few of these formative tests. Always remember the goal of a formative is not to pass the test. The goal of a formative is to learn and have empathy about what the user is doing. So we like to take a look at the whole area and think of it like a play, like you're going to watch Shakespeare in the park. And when you go to a play, you think of a number of things. First of all, there's the actors, and you want to watch the actors and pay attention to the actors. But there's also the props. So you want to pay attention to the props and how they interact with what's going on. And then there's the stage. You've got to pay attention to the stage. In Broadway plays, the amount of effort that goes into the stage is huge, and it has an impact on the play. And that's exactly what happens in the medtech arena. And then you want to pay attention to the action and what's happening in the action. And the action tends to be what people only focus on. And if they miss the actors and the stage and the props, they're going to miss some very key requirements, some design inputs that will become requirements that will make the device more innovative and more successful. And this is why it's so important to focus on these things. So when we go in and do this, we like to break the task down into 8 job steps, the 8 universal job steps. We like to look at a user and a device and think about what are they doing to define the situation? What are they doing to locate things they need to locate? How are they preparing? How are they confirming that things are ready? How do they execute when it's time to execute the activity? How are they monitoring what's going on? And do they have to make any modifications? And then after they do, how do they conclude? And if we can watch users and be that fly on the wall and watch them in these areas, we can gather a ton of data. And so what we look for in every one of these areas is we look for what we call metrics. And those are the steps and the tasks that are necessary in each one of those 8 buckets that are necessary for the user to go through in order to be successful with this device or system or software or whatever it is that we're developing. And so we note those metrics, and then we look for pain points related to each of those metrics. So while we're in there watching, we're being this fly on the wall, we're looking and saying and asking ourselves, well, what's difficult? What's time consuming? What's slowing down? Is this person having a difficulty seeing underneath that C-arm and looking at the place where the activity is happening? Is their view blocked? Or are these 2 people trying to pass an instrument back and forth, and are their hands getting tangled? Are they dropping items? Simple things like that. Now, those are very simple examples. Obviously, there's more in-depth functional examples, but the point is, We're looking for pain points with each of those metrics that go into each of those job steps as we're observing and being that fly on the wall. And so that's what formative studies are all about. So we can have successful failure by just gaining empathy and understanding what the pain points are, because every one of those pain points is a failure. But then that pain point will be written as a design input, will become a requirement that we design against to have success when we do our summative study in the end, and we go through verification and validation. So formative studies, again, we can use, just as a recap, we can use very simple prototypes like that ergonomic model on the left, fully functional on the right. That could also be considered a formative study, because they're all formative studies until you do your summative, where you're doing your validation at the end. So those are all examples of things that we've done those kinds of studies. But now Mitch is going to share a little bit about some of the levels of testing that they go through and how they approach some of these tests. So Mitch, jump in and let's hear some best practices from your group.
Sure, thank you. As Tom made some good points, a lot of that has to do with definition of requirements, and from an engineering perspective, as you can imagine, we try as best as possible with this early data to abstract the engineering characteristics of the product. We try to capture that into the requirements, so that enables us to do functional kinds of tests at early stages, trying to do those tests and perform those tests at the least amount of effort with the least amount of cost. One of the things we do quite often, especially it happens quite often with medtech products, we're really concerned about reliability and long-term reliability of products. And I think many of you may be familiar with the term HALT, which stands for highly accelerated life testing. Oftentimes, you're not only looking for achievement of the performance goals and meeting the requirements in the initial early stages of the product use, but you're also often concerned about the ability to sustain those performance characteristics over what could be a fairly long life of the product. Many of you who are in engineering are familiar with this concept. We often, even in medtech devices, we often try to leverage off-the-shelf equipment. Sometimes it's targeted toward commercial applications or maybe even consumer, and we're trying to leverage that technology into our medical technology based products. By doing that, sometimes we need to have data about the components, the lowest level items that are going to be used in the system design. We need performance characteristics that may or may not be available from the manufacturer. It's particularly the case when you're dealing with extreme cases of environmental. You may just not get the durability data that you're looking for from a manufacturer, because the primary use case doesn't really need that. Yet those components may be useful to you in the design of the product. And I think, again, if we're working in a process that's going to ultimately involve some kind of highly accelerated life testing, you don't just design the product and throw it into HALT and see what you get. At that point, if you find errors, if you find problems, and HALT is designed, as you can imagine, to find problems. If you find problems then and you haven't done the bottoms up build up, you have a very expensive, time-consuming process to take corrective action. So oftentimes that starts at the component level, and we need to define through testing performance characteristics of the components we're planning to use in the product. Quite often that happens in the electronics, but it also happens in the mechanical side as well. Next. The next step, as you can imagine, is we try to build up from those components to subsystems. If we wait until a design is complete to see if we're satisfying all the requirements, again, we're in a situation where if something is found in testing, and obviously anything you find in testing before the product gets to the field is orders of magnitude less expensive to fix than once the product's been deployed. We often have to do testing at a subsystem level. In the electronics world, we might make up prototype boards or things like that to sort of test electronic function. In software, in an agile process, we might have the software broken down and architected into modules, and we will perform, low-level tests at the module level. When we talk about mechanicals, we might be doing simulated tests, maybe using rapid prototyping methods. If we need to get a higher level of fidelity with finished product properties, we might go to machined or other fabricated processes. But we try to test at the lowest level so that we could try to precipitate the things that will fail at a later date. The next level, of course, up is system level testing. We can take that up. And here we're really starting to talk about the downstream testing. Tom showed some good examples that might be system level tests when he talked about the functional prototypes. They may not even be necessarily with tooled or manufactured parts. They could be with simulated parts that physically and electrically and software represent what's going to be in the finished product. But these things these system level tests are not necessarily ones that have gone through all of the validation processes before we take them into a clinical trial.
Can I make a quick point here? So oftentimes when this level of testing is done and you're testing a system, and like you described, it's not a finished system. It's rudimentary. It might be an alpha unit. Oftentimes, and this is the point I was trying to make earlier, and maybe I didn't clarify it enough, but obviously when you're doing this kind of a system test, the most important thing is getting the functionality out of the device. That's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to see, does it function right? Am I hitting my parameters? If it's, let's say it's delivering therapy, is it delivering the therapy at the right level? That's what you're shooting for. What I was trying to sort of push for earlier was, obviously that's the number one goal, but these tests also make really great formative studies for your user requirements. And it doesn't take a lot of effort to, at the same time, sort of double up and get some user requirement data out of these tests if you just set it up right. And really what you're doing is you're getting sort of a formative usability test out of a systems engineering test, and you can do both at the same time. Now there's people that'll argue that maybe you shouldn't do that, or it's too hard to run a test and get both things. And I'm not saying you can do that all the time, but I'm just saying be aware of the possibility, because we've done that a number of times. Mm-hmm. And it really helps you be efficient and save time and money, because you're kind of killing two birds with one stone, and you're kind of getting a free formative study out of your systems engineering test. So if you're thinking about that sort of successful failure mentality that we're talking about, then you can test for several different things while you're at this phase, and you shouldn't ignore that. You should at least be open to that and welcome the opportunity to do that.
Some of the things we've done in these, what Tom's called a fully functional prototype, oftentimes when we try to do that early, I'll give you some examples of things we've done in the past. Oftentimes, we're developing it with electronics that's going to use, let's say it's targeted to use a specific microprocessor. We'll often try to build prototypes using single board computers that have that processor. So we're doing our development and our embedded software using that microprocessor. It may be cabled externally in a non-product way to an external display, and on that display we may be running a prototype of the application that is, rather than being on a small device to screen or a device screen. It might be on a mobile device screen that's remote, where in a final product embodiment, all of these things may be integrated in the single board computer. That worked fine because we removed it from the physical enclosure, and we were able to simulate the performance of the ultimate system. The ultimate system would eventually have that same chipset down on a purpose-driven board, but we get really good engineering data out of that early functional prototype that shows whether we're getting the speeds and feeds that we're looking for, and the processing and the energy management, or whatever characteristics we're trying to optimize. We can get those in an early stage prototype.
Good, thanks.
Yep. There's a, as we go through the back end here, in any med tech product, no matter what the class, especially within the more rigorous classes of certification, we have to go through fairly rigorous testing to validate that the system performs as expected and that the requirements are being met. It's important, I think, because there's a lot of ambiguity about terms. It's important to really define what these sort of downstream tests are, what their purposes are, and what they're good for and bad for. I mean, in the end, we're trying to do these verification and product tests in order to be able to, as Tom pointed out, try to shake out any problems before we end up with a product. Again, all in the mindset that you want to get to these issues as early as possible. So, we often do, and I think these terms will be familiar to many of you, what's called EVT. These are generally engineering-oriented prototypes. Oftentimes when we're doing these, we'll have our designers working alongside of us to assess human factors and other kinds of characteristics. Oftentimes these will be kind of iterative tests. They're really to test the integrity of the design, but there can be limitations. Oftentimes these things won't have run through manufacturing, but the intended manufacturing processes. You might have rapid prototyping methods, or very, very extremely early parts that may be off of production tools, but really not production quality. So there are some limitations in the way these prototypes are built and used, but they're a good way of shaking out issues well before you get into the ramp up of the manufacturing processes. Next. Next, of course, the term we've often used is design validation testing. This is sometimes called alpha testing in a formal manufacturing process. In these stages, I think this is probably known to many of you, but if not, oftentimes these are using processes, circuit boards, plastic parts, whatever it may be, coming out of manufacturing processes, but these are going to be really early runs. So they may be run in quantities of 5s, 10s, 100s. But if you're building a product that's going to be, in thousands or tens of thousands, they won't have that benefit of steady state, stable manufacturing going on. And these processes are good and useful for manufacturing, but they're also very good for the downstream verification testing. This could be related to the FDA certification processes, but it's also, these models are often very good for things like getting environmental testing, for going for CE or UL testing. In the case of products that have wireless connectivity, it could be for FCC testing, or if it's using cellular communications, you might even have carrier certification testing that you do with these really early models, which is before you really start turning things on to deliver these units to products to final customers. Again, there's some there's really not so much limitations at this level in terms of going through the certifications, because the level of simulation here is extremely high. It's very close to representative, but what it doesn't reflect is the effects of a longer manufacturing run where you could have a variability that's driven by the manufacturing process.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, Mitch. And a lot of people ask that question, and there's a lot of discussion around that because for DVT, when it comes to getting your FDA clearance, of course, we're supposed to be testing to make sure that what we've built, and like Mitch said, at this point, what we've built is not a final representation, but we're trying to make sure that what we've built matches the design inputs that we put in. So from a design standpoint, the design inputs in our requirements document. And so we have to show that we made something that meets those. So because of that, we have to have things that are testable and measurable in order to do that. But we're not dealing with final items. So that's where this gets a little bit hairy, is people are trying to achieve testability and measurability in their tests, but they're using something that isn't final, so that might have an effect on it. This is where you got to get creative and find ways to get your prototyping to a level where you can achieve that in your DVT. Because of course, later on when you come to your validation, then you're testing your full system at a higher level for a broader set of criteria.
That's good. Yeah, and the final really level of testing is PVT, production validation testing. The DVT models and testing is close to what you're expecting in final production. But when you're in production, you're starting to run some significant volumes. You're really testing here to make sure that the process capabilities that you've built into your models, the tolerances, whether it be on the electronics or the mechanical side, on the software side, it's very heavy stress testing to try to invoke and shake out any issues. Here you're looking for process variability type problems, and again you're trying to shake those out, because if you're doing things that generate variability that may not show up in the DVT, you may end up having to push back earlier on to make some small corrective actions to ensure that the product is meeting all the requirements and is able to be built in a reliable, consistent way. Mm-hmm. So these are the key, these are some of the key, steps from an engineering standpoint of some of those more downstream tests we typically perform in development of a product.
Yeah, and when it comes to the validation effort, this is why, again, the whole idea about failing preclinicals is good. You don't want to fail your summative study. So when it comes to your design and your usability, and it's time to do a summative study, that's the one that you want to pass. You don't want failure there. So as many early tests that you can do to fail at, the better off you're going to be, because you don't want to have to do 2 summative studies. They're a bit more expensive, and oftentimes it's best to wait till the last possible moment. So some actual clinical work is being done, and you've got a good level of assurance that when it comes time to do a summative study, you're going to pass. So a lot of formatives being done ahead of time really helps sort of bank up against that. And I know in this talk, we're talking about a lot of different kinds of testing. And some of you may be thinking, well, we're supposed to be talking preclinical, and that's not what preclinical is. Technically, preclinical is, the realistic test that you do at the end prior to going to make sure that you're okay to go into your clinical work. And actually what we're saying here is anything before your clinical, we're calling preclinical work. And that's intentional for this talk that we're doing that. So just bear with us, because we're talking about this mentality again of every test you do along the way, whether it's an engineering verification of some sort, or it's on a component level or a system level. It all plays into that same level of thinking that you want to fail as many times as you can before you get to that final validation, because that's not when you want to be failing. It's when you're
The
going
term
through.
that we often use is like fail early and often, right? So, we're all familiar with, and many of us are really highly experienced at using a lot of the simulation tools that are available to digitally do design, and they have their value and they have their place, but testing, is about finding the unexpected. And when you say fail early and often, no matter what stage, whether it's the earliest stage that Tom described, where we're doing form factor studies at the earliest stages, finding and fixing problems at those earliest stages. The earlier you find them, the earlier you fix them, the less expensive it's going to be to put those get those corrections in, and the more valuable, and the more insightful those failures are.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mitch. And we like to always say, fail early, fail often, but fail smart. And I guess that's what we're talking about here today, because if you're just failing early and failing often, but you're not doing it smart, you could be shooting yourself in the foot too.
Mm-hmm.
So part of failing smart is what Mitch just described, doing some of those early simple things at the beginning. That's how you do it smart, by getting a lot of options in front of a lot of people in a quick, cheap, efficient, and easy way early. So you're not spending a lot of time and money exploring a lot of options. So that could be those simple models or drawings or sketches or whatever, simple, software, whatever you want to do. Getting that feedback from people early is going to hone down. So when you start doing more rigorous testing, you're doing your rigorous testing on something that you have a higher level of assurance that it's going to work. And that's all about removing risk. So that's how you fail smart and do it early and often. So I wanted to just quickly, we just have a minute or two left, and I just wanted to talk about a case study that kind of drives some of this thinking home. And Mitch, feel free if other case studies pop to mind too. Let's discuss those. But here's one that had to do with rheumatoid arthritis. So patients who are suffering with rheumatoid arthritis, and they needed an injection device, like an EpiPen of sorts, to actually inject themselves regularly with a drug to relieve their rheumatoid arthritis. And so we, in this process to develop this device, now in this particular case, I'm talking about something that's purely mechanical. So we're just living in the mechanical world here for a second. And we had to develop this EpiPen type device. So we went through all of the things that Mitch and I have been talking about, all of these levels of testing early, finding those pain points, looking at those metrics, understanding what the user needs to do, making sure those pain points led to design inputs that went into the requirements document. And then in our testing, as we did all of our preclinical testing, we were testing against a very strong, robust set of requirements. And those were functional and engineering, but they were also user and product requirements. And it got us to a product in the end that worked really well. And this was the device, this EpiPen injector device. And what I put off on the right-hand side was a list of functions or features that this device has. And I think at least 75% of those things on that list are things that were discovered in that higher level of rigor testing, where we were looking to fail and doing some of these things. And it was a situation where the customer didn't necessarily want to do that. They wanted to just kind of, here's the requirements we know, this is the voice of customer that we know, it has to perform to these characteristics. Here's an idea, let's build it and test it. And we were thinking about that fail smart part of failing early and often, saying, hold on a second, wait a minute. Let's explore a bunch of options and let's test those options in a number of different ways. And let's have a bunch of successful failures as we go down that path. So by the time we get to the point where we're spending real engineering dollars, we have a high level of confidence that what we're going to end up testing and validating is going to pass on the first time through. And so we did that. We did it just the way that Mitch and I have been describing it to you. And if you look at some of these things like the needle shield stripper, an easy safety mechanism, a 1, 2, 3 operation, I mean, just all of these things down, this needle lockout, having it be activated without a button, all of these things came from that. And that gave this device its ability to function well and have a good lifespan, but also be well accepted by the user group. Because in the end, if you design something that's great functionally, but it's not accepted by the users, you've just sort of wasted everyone's time and money. So if you see that list, it's like, wow, that's a lot of stuff over there that helped make this successful, just based on that kind of mentality and that kind of thinking and testing. So, all right, well, we've run to the end of our time here. We just have a few minutes left on the line. So, you guys have been sending questions through the chat as we've been talking, and Mitch and I have been answering you. But since there's a few minutes left in the hour here, Mitch and I are going to hang on for a few minutes. So if you still have questions, please continue to send us questions in the chat, and we will answer those. And we're also going to make ourselves available to afterwards. So anytime afterwards, you have our contact information here on the screen. Feel free to email or call Mitch or myself, and we're more than happy to answer questions and talk about anything related to medtech product development and testing. So please reach out, and we look forward to chatting soon.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this MD&M Biomed Digital session. Before the next session launches, we'd like to thank our speakers, exhibitors, attending media, and partners for sharing their time and insight with us this week. Your knowledge and support is invaluable.